From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana, Siddiqui. First, the headlines. Number of refugees fleeing Ukraine reaches over 1.7 million. White House rejects Senator Graham's call for assassination of Putin. Spanish police filmed a beating African migrant who crossed border. COVID-19 and infectious diseases worsen suffering in Yemen. Rohingya boat with dozens of children lands in Indonesia's Aceh province. Organization of Islamic Cooperation opens office in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. Our top story tonight. About 1.7 million Ukrainian refugees have crossed into neighboring countries in 11 days. UN High Commissioner for Refugees Filippo Grandi said Sunday it is the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Previously, the Syrian war was considered the largest global refugee crisis. The UK has rejected opening its borders to Ukrainian refugees. Ukraine's Roma refugees say they were discriminated against by the Ukrainian border police en route to safety. Last week, the African Union criticized Ukrainian police for discriminating against Africans seeking to leave. Moscow offered to set up humanitarian corridors from several bombarded Ukrainian cities on Monday. But Ukrainian leaders dismissed the offer after learning some routes would lead refugees into Russia or Belarus. Russian President Vladimir Putin said the war will continue until Ukraine accepts his demands and ends its resistance. So far, international sanctions intended to punish Moscow have not slowed the invasion. Thousands of people have applied to the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. in a bid to join the Ukrainian army in its fight against Russia. A military official at the embassy told Andalu agency they received more than 3,000 emails from those who wanted to go to Ukraine. They were asked to fill out an application form. Applications will be screened to check who is capable of going, the official said. Less than half of those who inquired in emails filed applications, according to the official. Applicants included former military officials and civilians who wanted to help with the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Ukraine. U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham is facing bipartisan backlash after publicly calling for Russian President Vladimir Putin's assassination. In a Twitter post on Thursday, Graham referred to one of Roman ruler Julius Caesar's assassins and the German officer who tried to kill Adolf Hitler. Graham called for someone in Russia to take Putin out, adding that person would be doing Russia and the world a great service. His comments were met with swift rebukes from Democrats and Republicans alike. Progressive Congresswoman Ilhan Omar called for U.S. lawmakers to cool it and regulate the remarks as the administration works to avoid World War III. Spain's Interior Ministry denied wrongdoing Friday after a viral video showing several Spanish agents beating a young African migrant who crossed the border into the city of Melilla. The video was captured by Spain's public broadcaster RTVE. It shows a young man, possibly a minor, slowly climbing down the border fence separating Spain's African territory from Morocco. Once the young man gets close to Spanish soil, agents begin striking him with their batons. The migrant then drops off the fence and 7 officers encircle him, simultaneously beating him with their batons. Once the young man is on the ground, the agents can be seen hitting, kicking, and perhaps even stomping on him. Spain's Interior Ministry spokesman said the armed forces act within a legal framework and with criteria of appropriateness and proportionality. A university in Munich, Germany has apologized publicly to 2 Muslim women students for discriminatory practices during online exams. The incident sparked widespread criticism on social media, prompting the apology. HM Hot School München said on Twitter it offered sincere apologies to the students who were asked by instructors to remove their headscarves to rule out suspicion of fraud. Religious headdresses cannot be compared to ordinary fashion accessories, and they have to be handled differently, the university's management said. The school promised it would change the instructions given to exam supervisors to ensure they observe respect for religious freedom. While Germany's constitution guarantees freedom of religion, Muslims, especially women donning a headscarf, often face discriminatory practices in education and the labor market. A new UN report calls on Canada to amend legislation that potentially strips tens of thousands of Indigenous women of Indian status for marrying non-Indigenous men. While Indigenous women lose their status under Canada's Indian Act, which was passed in 1876, their children cannot inherit their mother's heritage status. Indigenous men, however, can because their designation is not affected no matter who they marry. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women said in its report the issue stems from disrespect of Indigenous people's fundamental right to self-identification. The UN wants Canada to change the legislation so that both Indigenous men and women have the same rights of inheritance status. We're bringing more news stories after the break, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. Brothers and sisters, we all watch the Allahu Akbar lady from India. She's amazing, isn't she? She's neither compromising her hijab nor her education. She's standing tall. We must stand with her. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect her. But it is not just hijab, brothers and sisters. Indian Muslims are facing genocide.
Genocide that we face in India is not a new phenomenon. India has had several genocides.
They are attacked every day. Even the Indian government admits there has been more than 1,800 organized attacks on Muslims, but they call it riot. 660 people are hanged to death in India, lynched in broad daylight, sometimes just because they were accused of eating beef. Yes, accusation of eating beef can kill a human being in India. We cannot remain silent, can we? Alhamdulillah, OIC has spoken, that is good, but why in the World United Nations is silent? The UN has a responsibility to protect. It has a duty to prevent genocide. Sisters and brothers, we must stand with Indian Muslims and other minorities. We are free, they are not. We are not attacked, they are under attack day and night. Let's do our job. I have signed this UN petition. I ask you to sign it now. Thank you so much.
Welcome back. Yemen has seen a significant number of infectious diseases in various regions as the ongoing war has had a negative impact on the health sector. Health facilities are overcrowded with patients ravaged by various epidemics. Among the most prominent diseases currently prevalent in Yemen are dengue and viral fever. The continuing coronavirus outbreak and the lack of precautionary measures due to poverty and ignorance have worsened the situation. The ongoing war in Yemen has led to the destruction and damage of many health facilities. Only half of the medical sector is still working, according to previous UN reports. An international body fighting money laundering says the United Arab Emirates isn't doing enough to stop criminals and militants from hiding wealth there. Paris-based Financial Action Task Force on Friday placed UAE on its grey list of 23 countries, including Jordan, Syria, and Yemen. The Emirates, a federation of 7 sheikdoms on the Arabian Peninsula, is home to a multitude of economic free zones and real estate ventures. Its inclusion on the list could strike at the country's carefully managed business-friendly image. Ratings agencies and other financial institutions also consider such a listing as a risk, which can affect interest rates for loans. Senior Emirati diplomat Anwar Gargash wrote on Twitter the country has made significant progress in combating financial crime. A boat carrying more than 100 Rohingya refugees, including dozens of children, landed on the coast of Indonesia's westernmost province Aceh on Sunday, police said. The vessel sailed from a Rohingya camp in Bangladesh, arriving shortly after 3 a.m. on a beach in Bidiyun district. It carried 114 people, including 58 men, 21 women, and 35 children under 15 years, police said. Police Chief Mike Hardy Wirapaya told AFP the migrants should receive a general health checkup and COVID-19 rapid antigen tests. They would later be transferred to a neighboring district, which has a shelter for refugees. It is the second wave of the persecuted minority arriving in Muslim-majority Indonesia in recent months. Morocco's Islamic financing landscape continues to grow, with home loans reaching $1.6 billion at the start of 2022. Islamic financing for Morocco's housing market showed positive growth signs at the end of January 2022. It increased 39.6% from the $1.1 billion recorded in January 2021. Islamic financing for housing loans is the fastest growing banking service, according to data from Morocco's central bank, Bank al-Maghrib. Debuting in late 2018, Islamic financing is on the rise in Morocco. The sector now holds 5 Islamic banks, including Bank al-Safa, Umniya Bank, Al-Akhdar Bank, Bank al-Yusr, and Bank al-Tamwila al-Imma, as well as 3 Islamic funding structures. The Organization for Islamic Cooperation, or OIC, opened its office in Kabul, which is tasked with coordinating humanitarian efforts with Afghanistan and international partners. Mohammed Saeed Al-Ayyash is director of OIC's Afghanistan office, OIC said on Twitter. The office will monitor the implementation of the outcome of the ministerial conference held in Pakistan last December. At that meeting, a draft resolution was passed to establish a humanitarian trust fund to channel humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. Member states agreed to establish the fund through the Islamic Development Bank. OIC urged the bank to initiate the trust fund by the first quarter of 2022. The Taliban seized control over Afghanistan last August, and the country has since been facing a looming economic meltdown and humanitarian catastrophe. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government in a case filed by 3 Muslim men who accused the FBI of spying on them after the September 11, 2001 attacks. The court unanimously ruled the government had the right to invoke the state secrets privilege and refused to provide information, allowing the court to study the men's complaint. The judgment did not shut down the case entirely. However, it overrides a 2019 decision by an appeals court and returns the case to the lower court for examination. The American Civil Liberties Union, representing the plaintiffs, called the decision a dangerous sign for religious freedom and government accountability. A convoy of hundreds of truckers and their supporters set off from Southern California Wednesday toward the nation's capital protesting pandemic restrictions. Inspired by the recent demonstrations that crippled Canadian cities for weeks, convoy organizers seek an end to mask mandates, vaccination requirements, and business shutdowns. Everybody's here for different reasons, but it all boils down to the same thing: freedom and liberty, said Shane Klass, who traveled from Idaho to join the rally. Though organizers say they do not intend to enter Washington, D.C., the government has mobilized 700 National Guard troops to provide added securities. Authorities fear a repeat of the January 6, 2021 mob violence by supporters of former President Donald Trump. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
I am what hunger looks like in America. I am an 8-year-old girl who's not excited for the last day of school. Because this may be the last time I'll have lunch.
Till September.
I am a single father of 2
who works 3 part-time jobs, and that's still not enough to put food on the table.
I was created by artificial intelligence from faces of the 1 in 8 Americans who struggle with hunger.
Feeding America, 200 food banks strong.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. To discuss the media coverage of the Russian invasion and the current refugee crisis, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. United Nations says there are already 1.7 million refugees. News is coming out, first came out from African Union, that the refugees who are Black are being discriminated by the Ukrainian police and by Europeans as well. Now news is coming out a little bit that there is some fake information being generated by Ukraine, and I'm pretty sure Russia is trying to do the same thing. To discuss with us is someone who has spent quite a bit of time analyzing media, Jeff Cohn. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Great to be with you.
Jeff Cohn is a co-founder of rootsaction.org, a retired journalism professor who has spent some time on cable news. He has a book, Cable News Confidential, My Disadventures in Corporate Media. And he is also the founder of a media watch group, FAIR. Well, tell us, what is your assessment of how Russian invasion is being covered in the US media?
I've had a lot of emotions watching the coverage. It's an atrocity that the Russians are perpetrating against people in Ukraine. I'm happy in US news media that for the first time I can remember, center stage in the coverage is the suffering of civilians, the death toll, the destruction of homes, the refugees. It's very touching. And I'm not happy with all of the pundits asking the Biden administration, when are you going to get tough? You've got to be tougher on Russia. I don't know that that's helpful journalism. But the center stage of civilian toll is very unusual. It's very different than when the US has invaded countries in the Middle East or Afghanistan. It's very different than the coverage of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. You just don't see the suffering. I believe when there's war, occupation, invasion, center stage should always be civilians. In modern warfare, civilians are the main victims. A lot of people get rich from war, but civilians are the main victims. So I'm heartened that finally, and I agree with you, I think it has something to do with the fact that the Ukrainian civilians are white Europeans. But it's still heartening that finally mainstream media understands that if you want to cover a war at its core, you have to focus on all the civilian toll.
That element, Jeff, I lived through the Iraq invasion and other bombing in Afghanistan and all that. Even when it was some human story, remember that Afghan girl whose eyes were blue and it became a sensation through National Geographic pictorial of that. Even then, it seems the only time we could humanize is when eye color is something which is appealing to the photographer.
It's very sad. I mean, there's a lot of ethnocentrism and racism in US media coverage. I witnessed it firsthand when I worked in cable news. So the one factor is who are the victims when you're looking at the difference between coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the US invasion, for example, of Iraq. So one big distinction is who are the victims. And white European victims are deemed more worthy. But I think an even bigger factor is who are the culprits. When the United States invaded Iraq, it was also illegal. There was no United Nations Security Council resolution authorizing the war, and nor was the US acting in pure self-defense. So under international law, under the United Nations Charter, the invasion of Iraq was every bit as illegal as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But you never heard that in the mainstream media. There was no focus on civilians. It's atrocious what Russia is doing, bombing various cities of Ukraine. But there was nothing quite as massive as what was called shock and awe, the bombing of Iraq and Baghdad by the US military. And there was no sympathy for all these civilians that were buried beneath the rubble. Instead, you had news anchors on US television talking about how glorious it was when the bomber planes were taking off from aircraft carriers. They were effusive in their celebration. And again, it's who are the victims? And even more important, is the US behind the aggression? Because if that's the case, US mainstream media coverage will miss the boat on the illegality of the war and the civilian toll of the war.
Considering that you work in cable news, how does it work? I mean, some, what we call corporate media, are the corporations calling, hey, what you can do, what you cannot do? Or the journalists themselves are trained to or tilt in one direction or the other, or journalists are selected based on a certain criteria to follow a particular line? What is the mechanism in the newsroom for this?
I think it's a combination of all the factors that if you're in the newsroom, you learn what issues are wanted and what issues aren't. And when the US was bombing Iraq or when the US invaded Afghanistan, civilians is not what they wanted. Sometimes during a crisis, like during the run-up to the invasion of Iraq based on false pretense. I was working with Phil Donahue at MSNBC on the primetime show, the most watched program on MSNBC at the time. But because we were raising questions, is this invasion going to be moral? Will it be legal? Will it be effective? Will it be hurting all of these innocent civilians? Because we tried to raise those questions, management took us off the air. We were taken off the air, terminated 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq. And, there is these famous memos after the US invaded Afghanistan in 2001, where management at CNN sent a memo, 2 memos, to every news anchor, every correspondent, basically telling them to play down civilian casualties in Afghanistan and to sort of rationalize it. The anchors were instructed anytime there was any hint that civilians had been killed by the US military in the invasion of Afghanistan, they were supposed to read a statement. We must remember that this is unfolding because thousands of US civilians were recently killed in a terrorist incident. Now remember, this was weeks after 9/11. Who in the United States had forgotten 9/11? So, in the case, sometimes the word comes down from management. We were taken off of the air and we were terminated. My career in cable news ended 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq. And when people are sanctioned, journalists are fired, it sends a real strong message to all of those who remain of what stories are wanted and what stories are not. I would argue that Israel-Palestine is another one of these issues where if you focus on Israeli aggression against Palestinians, that is not wanted by management and your career may be in danger. So you're right. There's also a lot of self-censorship when journalists figure out what is wanted and what is not wanted.
Do you think there is a memo which has gone out to play up the civilian casualties in Ukraine, or people have reformed?
No, I think that's the human instinct. See, I don't think there needs to be a memo. If there wasn't this concern from management not to play up the victims of US military, the civilian victims, I think your human instinct is, wow, the biggest part of the story is there's this aerial bombardment of Baghdad or, Kiev. That's the human instinct. What is the main facet of this story? And clearly we know in Ukraine, it's the civilian toll. And that was the case in the Iraq. At least 70,000 civilians were killed in Iraq, probably many more. I'm sorry. The minimum is 170,000, the most conservative case of civilian deaths in Iraq. And some people estimate several 100,000 civilians. We haven't come anywhere close in Russia's horrible invasion of Ukraine, but at least U.S. journalists are focusing on the death toll and focusing on the homes and the tenements, the housing units that are being destroyed, and focusing on the refugees. That should always be the focus in war.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. A couple of other things. You know that African Union, on the second or the third day refugees were coming out, started saying that Black students from Africa are not being allowed to leave and being discriminated against. This morning news came out, the Roma people are also complaining that they're being blocked from leaving the country. But why this? I mean, are there, there is a set of confused information coming out. Russia is saying that they want to denazify Ukraine. And when we hear Black and Roma people being attacked and all that, is that influence substantial there? Well, the response of the Ukraine president is that, hey, I'm a Jew, how come you're accusing me of that? Right. So what is the racial confusion which is coming out in the news?
Yeah, look, it's not a Nazi regime. Even if Russia says it over and over that they're denazifying, any more than Saddam Hussein in Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. It's a pretext for war. But you are right. There is racism in all these societies. There is racism and bigotry and discrimination in Ukraine against Roma people, against Africans. And it came out, I think some of it's been shown in the US television news, that Africans were not able to cross the border. And of course, there's bigotry in Poland. There's bigotry in a lot of these countries that would not allow in immigrants when the immigrants were coming from Africa, when the immigrants were coming, the refugees were coming from Syria. The doors were not open. So there's no doubt that these societies, look, our society is racist against African Americans. There's Islamophobia in our country. But in Europe, you have these problems. It doesn't justify in any way Russia's horrific invasion of Ukraine, but it's a story worth covering, and I'm glad it's getting some coverage.
One of the news item, it came here and there, is that there is some fake news coming out of Ukraine to encourage people and create more sympathy. Probably Russia is doing the same thing. So how the social media playing out in this war? Because Iraq war, as I remember, was thoroughly controlled by, what it was called the embedded reporters through the American forces. Are there some embedded reporters here, or the social media is doing the job, or social media is being used to create a fake news?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up embedded journalists, because during the invasion of Iraq, that's one of the ways that the U.S. controlled the narrative. And a lot of those journalists were willing to be controlled. They were cheerleaders for the invasion of Iraq rather than reporters. But yeah, today we have this new problem called social media. It's both a solution and a problem. In many places, when there has been a violent repression of peaceful demonstrations in country after country, social media has gotten the word out. It's the way we learned about the repression against peaceful activists in various countries. But as you say, social media has also got the possibility that someone is going to fake something or put together video footage that wasn't taken there or at that time and presenting it as something that happened yesterday here. There's no doubt that social media can be a vehicle for fake news. But let's remember that one of the worst examples of fake news in modern media history was the news before the invasion of Iraq, when 98% of the people on television and in the front pages of the New York Times and the opinion pages of the Washington Post, they were pushing for an invasion of Iraq based on false pretenses, concocted stories, embellished stories that Saddam Hussein was somehow in league with Al-Qaeda. He wasn't. Or that Saddam Hussein was building up his nuclear weapons program that had stopped 10 years before the US invasion. So I think while we should all be wary when we get something from social media that it may not be true, let's remember that US mainstream media coverage of the invasion of Iraq was completely fake, and those were professional journalists.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff Cohen, for your analysis and being with the Muslim Network TV.
Thank you. I'm very honored.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.